The train wheels screeched against the metal tracks as the evening express pulled into Riverside Station. Steam hissed from the engine while passengers stepped down onto the wooden platform. Among them was Jack Morrison, a man whose expensive leather boots and fine coat marked him as someone important in these parts. At 28 years old, Jack owned the biggest cattle ranch in the county, with thousands of acres stretching as far as the eye could see. Jack had just returned from the city, where a business deal had gone wrong. He was supposed to buy another ranch that would have made him even richer, but the seller had changed his mind at the last minute. Now Jack was heading home with nothing to show for his trip except disappointment and a long train ride. The autumn wind cut through the air like a knife, making Jack pull his coat tighter around his shoulders. The sun had already set and most folks had gone home for dinner. The station was nearly empty except for the ticket master counting his money behind the window. That's when Jack noticed her. On a wooden bench near the station house sat a young woman, maybe 22 or 23 years old. She was shivering so hard that Jack could see it from across the platform. Her dress was clean but worn thin, and she had wrapped her arms around herself trying to stay warm. A small brown bag sat beside her on the bench. Everything she owned in the world by the looks of it. Jack had seen plenty of fancy ladies in his time, dressed in silk and jewelry, but something about this girl caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she sat so straight despite being cold and tired. Maybe it was how she didn't ask anyone for help, even though she clearly needed it. Her name was Annie Walsh, though Jack didn't know it yet. She had been sitting on that bench for 3 hours, waiting for the late train that would take her to the next town over. Annie had grown up on a small farm with her father and 2 younger brothers. They raised a few cattle and grew some crops, nothing fancy, but enough to get by. Everything had changed 2 months ago when her father started gambling at the saloon in town. At first, it was just a few dollars here and there, but then he started losing bigger amounts. Soon he was betting money they didn't have, promising to pay back his debts with the next harvest. The harvest had been poor that year. The rains came too late and half their crops dried up in the fields. When the men came to collect the gambling debts, her father had nothing to give them. They took the cattle first, then the farm equipment, and finally the land itself. Annie had tried to find work in their small town, but there wasn't much available for a young woman with no connections. She could read and write, which was more than many folks could say, and she knew how to work with horses and cattle from growing up on the farm. But none of that mattered when there were no jobs to be found. She had saved every penny she could get her hands on, doing laundry for the hotel and cleaning houses for the few families who could afford help. Finally, she had enough money for a train ticket to Millbrook, the next big town where she hoped to find work as a housekeeper, or maybe in one of the shops. Jack watched the girl shiver on the bench and felt something stir in his chest. He remembered being hungry and cold himself, back when he was young and had nothing. His own father had died when Jack was just 16, leaving him with a small piece of land and a handful of cattle. Through hard work and some lucky deals, he had built that into an empire. But he never forgot what it felt like to have nowhere to go. Walking over to the bench, Jack cleared his throat softly so he wouldn't startle her. Annie looked up with wide green eyes, ready to defend herself if needed. She had learned to be careful around strangers, especially men with money who might want something from her. "Excuse me, miss," Jack said, taking off his hat politely. "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting here a while. The next train doesn't come until morning." Annie's heart sank. She had been told the late train would arrive by 9 o'clock, but it was already past 10. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid so," Jack replied. "The evening train only runs on weekdays and today's Saturday." He could see the worry in her eyes and the way her hands shook from cold. "Is there somewhere you can stay for the night?" Annie shook her head. She had exactly enough money for the train ticket and maybe one meal. There was no money for a hotel room, and she didn't know a soul in this town who might take her in. Jack made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Listen, I know this might sound strange, but I own a ranch just outside town. We've got a spare room in the main house where you could stay tonight. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, makes sure everything's proper and respectable." Annie studied his face, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick, but Jack's eyes were kind, and he stood a respectful distance away, not trying to crowd her or make her feel trapped. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know my name." "Because someone helped me once when I needed it," Jack said simply. "And because it's the right thing to do." After a moment, Annie nodded. She didn't have many choices, and something told her this man could be trusted. "My name is Annie Walsh," she said, standing up and picking up her bag. "Jack Morrison," he replied, extending his hand for a polite handshake. "My carriage is just outside. We'll have you warm and fed in no time." As they walked toward the station exit, neither of them realized that this chance meeting would soon have the whole town talking. Jack Morrison, the wealthy cattle baron, and Annie Walsh, a farm girl with nothing but the clothes on her back, had just taken the first step toward a love story that would shake their small community to its very foundation. The carriage ride to the ranch was quiet, with both of them lost in their own thoughts about what tomorrow might bring. The Morrison ranch spread out before them like something from a dream. Even in the darkness, Annie could see the white fences stretching into the distance and the outline of a big house, with warm light glowing in the windows. She had never seen anything so grand in her whole life. Jack helped her down from the carriage, being careful to keep his distance and act like a perfect gentleman. "Mrs. Chen will get you settled," he said as they walked up the front steps. "She's been taking care of this house longer than I've owned it." The front door opened before they could knock, and a small Asian woman appeared. Mrs. Chen had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Annie's thin dress and shivering frame and immediately went into action. "Poor child, you're frozen solid," Mrs. Chen said, ushering Annie inside. Come, we'll get you warm and fed right away." She turned to Jack with a look that said she approved of his decision to help the girl. The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. Rich wood furniture filled the rooms, and thick carpets covered the floors. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, making the whole place feel cozy despite its size. "I'll leave you ladies to get acquainted," Jack said, hanging his hat on a wooden peg by the door. "Mrs. Chen, please make sure our guest has everything she needs." Annie found herself in a comfortable bedroom with a real bed, not just a pile of blankets on the floor like she was used to. Mrs. Chen brought her hot soup and fresh bread, the best meal she had eaten in months. "So tell me, child," Mrs. Chen said as Annie ate, "what's your story?" Jack doesn't usually bring home strays, human or otherwise. Annie told her everything about the farm, her father's gambling, losing their home, and her plan to find work in the next town. Mrs. Chen listened without judgment, nodding at the right places and making sympathetic sounds when the story got particularly sad. "Can you work with animals?" Mrs. Chen asked when Annie finished her tale. "Yes, ma'am. I've been around horses and cattle my whole life. I can ride, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Good, because I think Jack might have a proposition for you in the morning." Annie slept better that night than she had in weeks, between clean sheets in a warm room. She woke up early out of habit and found Mrs. Chen already busy in the kitchen, making breakfast for the ranch hands. "Jack wants to see you after you eat," Mrs. Chen said, setting a plate of eggs and bacon in front of Annie. "He's out by the horse barn." Annie made her way outside, nervous about what Jack might want to discuss. The ranch looked even bigger in the daylight, with cattle dotting the hills and cowboys already hard at work. She found Jack standing next to a fence watching a beautiful black horse run around a small corral. "Morning, Annie," he said with a smile. "Sleep well?" "Yes, sir. Better than I have in a long time. Thank you for your kindness." Jack nodded toward the horse. "That's Thunder. He's got spirit, but he's never been properly broken. Most of my men are afraid to get near him." He turned to look at Annie. "Mrs. Chen tells me you know your way around horses." "I do, sir. My father taught me when I was little. How would you feel about staying here and working for me? I need someone good with horses, and you need a job. Seems like it might work out for both of us." Annie couldn't believe what she was hearing. A real job on this beautiful ranch with honest people who had already shown her more kindness than she had received in months. "What kind of work would I be doing?" she asked, trying not to sound too eager. "Taking care of the horses, mainly. Making sure they're fed and groomed. Helping break the wild ones, keeping the stables clean. It's hard work, and the pay isn't much, but you'd have a place to sleep and 3 meals a day." "I'll take it," Annie said without hesitation. Jack grinned. "Don't you want to know how much I'm paying you first?" "Whatever it is, it's more than I have now," Annie replied. "And I promise you won't regret giving me this chance." Over the next few days, Annie proved she was worth every penny. She had a natural gift with horses that amazed even the most experienced cowboys on the ranch. Thunder, the black stallion that no one else could handle, became calm and gentle around her. "I ain't never seen anything like it," said old Pete, the head ranch hand who had been working with horses for 40 years. "That girl's got magic in her hands or something." Annie didn't think it was magic. She just understood that horses were like people. They needed to trust you before they'd let you help them. She spent hours talking to Thunder in a soft voice, letting him get used to her smell and her presence before she ever tried to put a saddle on him. Jack found himself making excuses to visit the horse barn, supposedly checking on the animals but really watching Annie work. There was something peaceful about the way she moved around the horses, never rushing or getting frustrated when they didn't cooperate. "You've got a real talent," he told her one afternoon as she brushed Thunder's coat until it shone like black silk. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I love working with them. Each horse has its own personality, just like people do. Please call me Jack. Mr. Morrison was my father." Annie blushed a little at the informal way he spoke to her. In her experience, rich folks didn't usually ask farm girls to use their first names. As the weeks passed, their conversations grew longer and more personal. Jack learned that Annie could read and write better than most men he knew, and that she had a quick mind for figuring out problems. She learned that despite all his money and success, Jack was lonely with no family left and few real friends. The other ranch hands accepted Annie quickly. She worked as hard as any of them, never complained about the long hours or dirty work, and had a way of making everyone laugh with her stories and jokes. She fit in like she had been there for years instead of weeks, but not everyone was happy about the arrangement. Word had gotten out in town that Jack Morrison had hired a young woman to work on his ranch, and some folks thought it wasn't proper. A wealthy bachelor and a pretty girl working so closely together was bound to cause talk. Annie heard the whispers when she went into town for supplies, but she tried to ignore them. She had finally found a place where she belonged, and she wasn't going to let gossip ruin it for her. Winter was coming to the ranch, and Annie had been working there for almost 2 months. Every morning she woke up before sunrise to feed the horses and muck out their stalls. Her hands had grown calloused from the hard work, but she had never been happier. The other ranch hands had completely accepted her as one of their own. There was old Pete, who had taught her tricks for handling difficult horses. Billy was just 19 and treated Annie like the sister he never had. Carlos could rope a steer faster than anyone Annie had ever seen, and he was teaching her the proper way to throw a lasso. "You're getting better," Carlos said one afternoon as Annie successfully roped a fence post for the 10th time in a row. "Pretty soon you'll be ready to try it on a real cow." Annie laughed. "I don't know about that. The fence post doesn't try to run away." The men all chuckled. Annie had a way of making even the hardest days seem lighter with her humor and positive attitude. She never complained about the work, even when her back ached from lifting heavy feed bags or when the horses were being particularly stubborn. Jack found himself looking forward to their daily conversations more than he cared to admit. At first he had just been checking on her work, making sure she was settling in well, but now he realized he was seeking her out for other reasons. There was something different about Annie that he couldn't quite put his finger on. The wealthy ladies he had met in town were always worried about their dresses getting dirty or their hair getting messed up. Annie didn't seem to care about any of that. She would wade right into a muddy corral to check on a sick horse without thinking twice about it. "How's Thunder doing today?" Jack asked, approaching the corral where Annie was working with the black stallion. "Much better," Annie replied, not taking her eyes off the horse. "I think he's starting to trust me. Watch this." She held out her hand and Thunder walked over to nuzzle her palm gently. "That's incredible," Jack said. 3 months ago he wouldn't let anyone get within 10 feet of him. "He just needed someone to be patient with him," Annie said, stroking Thunder's neck. "Sometimes the most difficult animals are just scared and need to know they're safe." Jack wondered if she was talking about more than just horses. He had been difficult to get close to himself over the years, keeping people at arm's length to protect himself from getting hurt. As they worked side by side that day, Jack found himself really looking at Annie for the first time. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a practical braid, and her green eyes sparkled when she laughed. She was beautiful, but not in the fancy made-up way of the town ladies. Her beauty was natural and real. "Annie," he said as they walked back toward the house for dinner, "would you like to eat with me tonight? Mrs. Chen is making her famous pot roast, and it seems silly for you to eat alone in the kitchen when there's plenty of room at the dining table." Annie stopped walking and stared at him. I don't think that would be proper, Mr. Morrison. I mean, Jack, you're the boss and I'm just hired help. You're not just anything, Jack said firmly. You're part of this ranch now and I'd like your company for dinner. That's all. Annie looked uncertain, but she nodded. If you're sure it's all right. That evening, Annie sat at the big dining room table feeling completely out of place. She had never eaten anywhere so fancy, with real china plates and silver forks. Mrs. Chen had insisted she wear one of her better dresses, and she felt like she was playing dress-up. Relax, Jack said, noticing her nervousness. It's just dinner. Easy for you to say, Annie replied. You didn't grow up eating off tin plates and sitting on wooden crates. Jack's expression grew serious. Actually, I did. My family wasn't always wealthy, Annie. When I was your age, I was sleeping in a one-room cabin and wearing the same clothes for weeks at a time. Really? Annie asked, surprised. Really. My father died when I was 16 and left me with nothing but a small piece of land and 3 old cows. Everything you see here I built from scratch. As they ate, Jack told Annie about his early struggles, working 18-hour days and sleeping outside with his cattle to protect them from wolves and thieves. Annie shared her own stories about growing up on the farm, the good times before her father started gambling, and her dreams for the future. What do you want to do with your life? Jack asked as Mrs. Chen served them apple pie for dessert. I want to have my own place someday, Annie said. Not necessarily a big ranch like this, but somewhere I can raise horses and maybe some cattle. I want to prove that a woman can make it on her own if she works hard enough. Jack admired her determination. Most women he knew wanted to find a husband to take care of them, but Annie wanted to take care of herself. Their dinner conversations became a regular thing. Every few days, Jack would invite Annie to join him, and they would talk about everything from books they had read to their opinions about the weather. Annie discovered that Jack was well-educated and thoughtful, not at all like the rough cowboy she had expected a ranch owner to be. Jack learned that Annie was far smarter than her lack of formal education might suggest. She had taught herself to read by studying her father's old newspapers, and she had a natural understanding of business that impressed him. You know, Jack said one evening as they sat by the fireplace after dinner, I've been thinking about expanding the horse breeding operation. What do you think would be the best way to go about it? Annie was quiet for a moment, thinking. Well, Thunder would make an excellent stud horse. He's got the size and temperament for it now that he's settled down. And that mare, Daisy, she's got good bloodlines. Their foals would probably be worth a lot of money. That's exactly what I was thinking, Jack said, impressed. You've got a good head for this business, Annie. The compliment made Annie's cheeks turn pink with pleasure. She had never had anyone value her opinions before, especially not about something as important as business decisions. As winter settled over the ranch, Annie noticed that Jack was spending more and more time around the horse barn. He would bring her coffee in the morning and stay to chat while she worked. Sometimes he would help her with the heavier tasks, even though he had plenty of other things to do. Annie began to look forward to these visits more than she should have. Jack made her laugh with his stories about the early days of the ranch, and he listened to her ideas with genuine interest. She found herself thinking about him even when he wasn't around, wondering what he was doing and when she would see him next. But Annie knew she had to be careful. She was just a hired hand, and Jack was the wealthiest man in the county. People were already talking about them working so closely together. If anyone suspected there was something more than a professional relationship developing between them, it could ruin everything she had worked so hard to build. Still, when Jack smiled at her or laughed at one of her jokes, Annie felt something warm and hopeful stirring in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, there could be more between them than just boss and employee, but she was afraid to hope for too much, knowing that fairy tales like that didn't usually come true for girls like her. The first snow of winter fell on a Tuesday morning, covering the ranch in a blanket of white that made everything look magical. Annie stood at the barn door, watching the flakes drift down while she waited for the coffee Jack had promised to bring her. It had become their morning routine over the past few weeks. Jack would stop by the horse barn with 2 steaming cups, and they would talk while Annie went about her work. What had started as simple conversations about the horses had grown into something deeper and more personal. "Morning, Annie," Jack called out, walking carefully across the icy ground with their coffee. "Looks like winter's finally here for real." "Good morning," Annie replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. The horses don't seem to mind the cold, but I'm not sure how I feel about it yet. Jack laughed. You'll get used to it. I remember my first winter on the ranch. I thought I was going to freeze to death every single day. As they stood there sipping their coffee, Jack noticed that Annie had a small cut on her hand. What happened there? He asked, setting down his cup and reaching for her hand to examine the wound. Oh, it's nothing, Annie said, but she didn't pull her hand away. I caught it on a nail while I was fixing Thunder's stall gate yesterday. Jack's fingers were warm and gentle as he looked at the cut. This should be cleaned properly. You don't want it getting infected. For a moment, they stood there with Jack holding Annie's hand, neither of them moving or speaking. Annie could feel her heart beating faster, and she wondered if Jack could feel her pulse through her wrist. Annie, Jack said softly, looking into her eyes instead of at her hand. Yes, she whispered. But before Jack could say whatever he had been planning to, they heard the sound of approaching horses. They quickly stepped apart, both of them feeling guilty even though they hadn't really done anything wrong. Jack, called out a familiar voice. It was Dave Williams, Jack's neighbor and longtime friend. I was hoping to catch you before you got too busy with ranch work. Dave dismounted and walked over to them, tipping his hat politely to Annie. Miss Walsh, good morning. How are you settling in at the ranch? Very well, thank you, Mr. Williams, Annie replied, trying to act normal even though her heart was still racing from the moment she had just shared with Jack. Dave, what brings you out so early? Jack asked, though he seemed a bit annoyed at the interruption. Well, I wanted to talk to you about the winter social that's coming up next month. Helen's been planning it for weeks and she's hoping you'll come. It's been too long since you've been to one of our gatherings. Jack glanced at Annie, then back at Dave. I hadn't really thought about it. I've been pretty busy here on the ranch. Come on, Jack, you work too hard. Besides, there will be plenty of eligible young ladies there. Helen's been saying it's time you found yourself a wife and started a family. Annie felt her stomach drop at Dave's words. Of course Jack should find a wife. A man like him, with his wealth and position, could have his pick of any woman in the county. What had she been thinking? Imagining that there could be something between them. I'll think about it, Jack said, not sounding very enthusiastic. After Dave left, the comfortable mood between Jack and Annie had changed. They finished their coffee in awkward silence, both of them thinking about what Dave had said. Over the next few days, Annie tried to keep her distance from Jack. She focused on her work with the horses and avoided the main house except for meals. But Jack seemed determined to seek her out, finding excuses to visit the barn even more often than usual. You've been avoiding me, he said one afternoon, cornering her in Thunder's stall where she was brushing the horse's coat. I've been working, Annie replied, not looking at him. Isn't that what you pay me for? Annie, look at me. When she finally met his eyes, Jack continued. What Dave said the other day about me finding a wife, I want you to know that's not what I want. It's none of my business what you want, Annie said, though her voice was shaky. You're the boss and I'm just an employee. That's all we can ever be. Is that really what you think? Jack asked, moving closer to her. Because I think we both know there's more between us than just a working relationship. Annie's breath caught in her throat. Jack, we can't. People are already talking about us. If they thought there was something romantic happening, I don't care what people think, Jack said firmly. I care about you, Annie. More than I should, probably, but I can't help it. Before Annie could respond, Jack reached out and gently touched her face. You're not just some employee to me. You haven't been for a long time. The moment hung between them, full of possibility and danger. Annie wanted to lean into his touch to tell him that she cared about him too. But her practical side held her back. This can't happen, she whispered, even as she felt herself moving closer to him. You know it can't. Why not? Jack asked. Because of what other people will say? Because I have money and you don't? None of that matters to me. It matters to everyone else, Annie said. And eventually it would matter to you too. When your friends start treating you differently, when business deals fall through because people don't approve of your choice in women. Jack silenced her concerns by leaning down and kissing her softly. It was a gentle kiss, full of all the feelings they had been fighting for weeks. Annie kissed him back before she could stop herself, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Annie, Jack said, resting his forehead against hers. I'm falling in love with you. The words hit Annie like a physical blow. Don't say that, she said, tears forming in her eyes. Please don't say that. Why not? It's the truth. Because it makes everything so much harder, Annie said, stepping back from him. Jack, I'm nobody. I'm a farm girl with no money, no family, no connections. You could have any woman you want. I want you, Jack said simply. I don't care about anything else. But Annie could see the future stretching out before them, full of gossip and social pressure and people trying to tear them apart. She had just found a place where she belonged, and she was terrified of losing it. I need time to think, she said finally. This is all happening too fast. Jack nodded, though he looked disappointed. Take all the time you need. But Annie, don't let fear make this decision for you. What we have is real, and it's worth fighting for. As Jack left the barn, Annie sank down onto a bale of hay, her mind spinning. She loved him too, had been falling in love with him almost since the day they met. But love wasn't always enough, especially when the whole world seemed determined to keep them apart. That night, as she lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, Annie tried to imagine what her life would be like if she let herself love Jack Morrison openly. Would it be worth the scandal it would cause? Would their love be strong enough to survive the storms that were sure to come? Outside her window, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white and making everything look clean and new. But Annie knew that come morning, the real world would still be there, with all its rules and expectations and judgments. The question was whether she was brave enough to fight against all of that, for a chance at true love. News traveled fast in a small town like Riverside, and it didn't take long for word to spread about Jack Morrison and his pretty hired hand. What started as innocent gossip over coffee at the general store soon grew into something much more serious. It all began when Mrs. Fletcher, the banker's wife, saw Jack and Annie talking by the horse corral during one of her visits to discuss ranch business with Jack. She noticed the way they looked at each other, how they stood just a little closer than was strictly proper, and the soft smile on Jack's face when he talked to the girl. Mark my words, Mrs. Fletcher told her friend Catherine over tea the next day. There's something going on between Jack Morrison and that Walsh girl. A man doesn't look at his hired help the way I saw him looking at her, Catherine gasped. Surely not. Jack's too sensible for something like that. Besides, he's supposed to marry Judge Harrison's daughter. Everyone's been expecting it for years. But Mrs. Fletcher was convinced of what she had seen. I'm telling you, there's romance brewing out at that ranch, and it's going to cause a scandal if someone doesn't put a stop to it. Within a week, the rumor had reached every important family in town. Judge Harrison, who had been planning for his daughter Rebecca to marry Jack and unite their two powerful families, was furious when he heard the gossip. This is ridiculous, Judge Harrison said to his wife over dinner. Jack Morrison is not going to throw away his reputation for some nobody farm girl. I won't allow it. Mrs. Harrison nodded in agreement. Rebecca's been waiting for him to propose for over a year. This has gone on long enough. The judge decided to take action. The next morning, he rode out to the Morrison Ranch with 3 other prominent men from town: banker William Fletcher, Mayor Robert Stone, and wealthy merchant Thomas Clark. They found Jack in his office going over the ranch's books. Gentlemen, Jack said, looking up in surprise. This is unexpected. What can I do for you? Judge Harrison didn't waste time with pleasantries. Jack, we need to talk about this situation with the Walsh girl. Jack's expression immediately grew cold. What situation would that be? Don't play dumb with us, the judge said. The whole town is talking about you and your hired hand. People are saying there's something improper going on between you two. People need to mind their own business, Jack replied firmly. Banker Fletcher stepped forward. Jack, be reasonable. You're one of the most important men in this county. You can't afford to have this kind of scandal attached to your name. What scandal? Jack asked. I hired a woman to work with my horses because she's good at the job. Is that scandalous now? You know it's more than that, Mayor Stone said. The way you two look at each other, the time you spend together. It's not proper for a man of your position. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Jack, my daughter Rebecca has been waiting for you to propose. You know it makes sense for our families to unite. Don't throw that away for some foolish infatuation. Jack stood up slowly, his anger barely controlled. Gentlemen, I think you need to leave. Who I spend my time with and who I choose to marry is my business, not yours. Actually, it is our business, the judge said coldly. Your actions affect the whole community. If you continue this inappropriate relationship, there will be consequences. What kind of consequences? Jack asked. The kind that could hurt your business, Banker Fletcher said. Bank loans might become harder to get. Cattle buyers might look elsewhere. Social invitations might stop coming. The threat was clear. If Jack didn't end whatever was happening with Annie, the powerful men of the town would make his life very difficult. "Are you threatening me?" Jack asked. "We're giving you friendly advice," Judge Harrison replied. "End this thing with the girl and marry Rebecca like you should. That's what's best for everyone." After the men left, Jack sat alone in his office, furious and frustrated. He had worked hard to build his reputation and his business, but now it was all being threatened because he had feelings for a woman the town considered beneath him. Meanwhile, Annie was hearing her own version of the town's displeasure. When she went into town for supplies that afternoon, she noticed the cold stares and whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by. At the general store, the clerk who had always been friendly before was suddenly rude and unwelcoming. "We're all out of what you're looking for," he said when Annie asked for horse medicine that she could clearly see on the shelf behind him. At the post office, the postmaster made her wait while he helped 3 other people who had come in after her. When it was finally her turn, he barely looked at her and practically threw her mail at her. But the worst part came when she ran into Rebecca Harrison outside the bank. Rebecca was a beautiful blonde woman about Annie's age, dressed in an expensive blue dress and matching hat. She had always been polite to Annie before, but today was different. "Annie Walsh," Rebecca said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I hear congratulations are in order." "I'm sorry?" Annie asked, confused. "Oh, haven't you heard? Everyone in town is talking about your special friendship with Jack Morrison." "How exciting for you." Annie felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I don't know what you mean. Mr. Morrison is my employer, nothing more." Rebecca laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Of course he is, and I'm sure you work very hard to keep him happy." The implication in her words was clear and insulting. "I work with horses," Annie said firmly. "That's all." "How nice for you," Rebecca replied. "Though I do hope you're not getting any foolish ideas about your place here. Jack Morrison needs a wife who can help his social standing, not hurt it. I'm sure you understand." Annie understood perfectly. Rebecca was warning her to stay away from Jack, and she was doing it in a way that made Annie feel small and worthless. That evening, Annie was quiet during dinner with Jack and Mrs. Chen. She picked at her food and answered questions with short responses, clearly upset about something. "Annie, what's wrong?" Jack asked. "You seem troubled." "It's nothing," Annie said, not wanting to burden him with her problems. But Mrs. Chen, who had noticed Annie's mood the moment she walked in, wasn't fooled. "Child, something's bothering you. You might as well tell us what it is." Annie looked between Jack and Mrs. Chen, then sighed. "People in town are talking about us. They think there's something improper happening between us." Jack's jaw tightened. "What people?" "Everyone," Annie said. "The store clerk was rude to me, people were staring and whispering, and Rebecca Harrison basically told me to stay away from you." "Rebecca said what?" Jack asked, his voice dangerous. "It doesn't matter," Annie said quickly. "The point is, our friendship is causing problems. Maybe I should look for work somewhere else." "Absolutely not," Jack said firmly. "I'm not going to let a bunch of gossips drive you away from your home." "This isn't my home," Annie said sadly. "I'm just someone who works here, and if my being here is going to hurt you, then I should leave." Jack reached across the table and took her hand. "Annie, you are not going anywhere. This ranch is your home, and I won't let anyone tell you otherwise." Mrs. Chen watched the exchange with knowing eyes. She had seen the way Jack and Annie looked at each other, and she had been wondering when they would finally admit their feelings. But she also knew how cruel small towns could be to people who didn't follow the expected rules. "The heart wants what it wants," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "But sometimes what the heart wants comes with a very high price." That night, both Jack and Annie lay awake thinking about what Mrs. Chen had said. They were falling in love, but the whole town seemed determined to keep them apart. The question was whether their love was strong enough to survive the storm that was coming their way. Outside, the winter wind howled around the house, cold and unforgiving, much like the judgment of the people who thought they had the right to decide who deserved love and who didn't. The pressure from the town's elite was starting to show its effects on Jack's business, just as Judge Harrison had promised. Within 2 weeks of their visit to the ranch, Jack began noticing small but significant changes in how people treated him. When he went to the bank to discuss a loan for expanding his cattle operation, Banker Fletcher was suddenly full of excuses. "Interest rates are going up," Fletcher said, not quite meeting Jack's eyes. And with the economy being uncertain, we have to be more careful about large loans. Jack knew this was nonsense. His ranch was the most profitable in the county, and he had never missed a payment on anything. But he also understood the message being sent. At the monthly cattle auction, buyers who had always competed for Jack's beef were mysteriously less interested. Prices that should have been high were disappointingly low, and Jack found himself selling his cattle for less money than they were worth. Even the social invitations that had once filled his mailbox began to dry up. The winter social that Dave Williams had mentioned was coming up, but Jack never received an official invitation. When he asked Dave about it, his friend looked uncomfortable. "Well, Jack," Dave said, shuffling his feet, "Helen thought it might be better if you didn't come this year. You know, with all the talk and everything." "What talk, Dave?" Jack asked, though he knew exactly what his friend meant. "About you and the Walsh girl. Look, Jack, I like Annie. She seems like a nice enough person. But people are saying things and Helen doesn't want any drama at her party." Jack felt like he was watching his entire social world crumble around him. These were people he had known for years, men he had done business with, families he had considered friends. Now they were turning their backs on him because he had feelings for a woman they considered beneath him. The situation at the ranch was becoming difficult too. Some of the ranch hands were starting to act differently around Annie, and not in a good way. While old Pete, Billy, and Carlos remained loyal to her, a few of the newer hired men began making comments under their breath when they thought she couldn't hear. "Don't seem right," muttered Roy, one of the cowboys Jack had hired just before winter. "A pretty girl like that working so close with the boss. Makes a man wonder what her real job is around here." Pete overheard the comment and immediately set Roy straight. "You best watch your mouth when you're talking about Miss Annie," the old cowboy said firmly. "She works harder than any of us, and she's earned her place here fair and square." But the damage was being done. Annie could feel the tension in the air, and she knew she was the cause of it. The guilt was eating away at her, making her question whether her presence at the ranch was worth all the trouble it was causing. Things came to a head one snowy afternoon when Annie was working alone in the horse barn. She was grooming Thunder when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw Roy and another cowboy named Frank standing in the doorway, both of them smirking in a way that made her uncomfortable. "Well, well," Roy said, walking closer. "If it isn't the boss's special lady." Annie straightened up, holding the brush tightly in her hand. "I'm working, Roy. What do you need?" "Oh, we don't need anything," Frank said, moving to block the door. "We just wanted to have a little chat with you about your position here on the ranch." "My position is taking care of the horses," Annie said, trying to keep her voice steady. Roy laughed. "Is that what they're calling it now? Taking care of the horses?" Annie felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "I don't know what you're implying, but you're wrong." "Are we?" Roy asked, stepping even closer. "Because it seems to us like you've got the boss wrapped around your little finger. Must be nice having that kind of power over a man." "I think you should leave," Annie said, backing up against Thunder's stall. "We're just trying to be friendly," Frank said. "Maybe you could be friendly back. After all, if you're willing to be friendly with the boss, maybe you'd consider being friendly with the regular working men too." Annie's heart was racing with fear and anger. These men were suggesting something horrible, and she was trapped in the barn with them. She looked around for a way to escape, but they had positioned themselves between her and the door. "Get away from me," she said, her voice shaking. "Now don't be like that," Roy said, reaching out toward her. That's when Thunder did something unexpected. The black stallion, sensing Annie's distress, reared up in his stall and let out a loud, angry whinny. His hooves struck the wooden door of the stall with enough force to make the whole barn shake. The sudden noise startled Roy and Frank, and in that moment of confusion, Annie darted past them and ran toward the barn door. She could hear them laughing behind her as she fled, and their cruel words followed her out into the cold air. "Think about what we said, Annie. You can't hide behind the boss forever." Annie ran all the way to the main house, tears streaming down her face. She burst through the kitchen door, startling Mrs. Chen, who was preparing dinner. "Child, what's wrong?" Mrs. Chen asked, immediately putting down her knife and rushing to Annie's side. Through her tears, Annie told Mrs. Chen what had happened in the barn. The older woman's face grew dark with anger as she listened. "Those men should be ashamed of themselves," Mrs. Chen said. "You need to tell Jack about this right away." "I can't," Annie sobbed. "It will just make everything worse. He'll fire them. And then everyone will say it's because I have too much influence over him. They're already saying terrible things about me in town. Mrs. Chen held Annie while she cried, understanding the impossible position the girl was in. If Annie complained about the men's behavior, it would only fuel more gossip about her relationship with Jack. But if she said nothing, the harassment would likely continue and possibly get worse. Annie, Mrs. Chen said gently, you can't let them treat you this way. You've done nothing wrong and you don't deserve this. Maybe I should just leave, Annie said. Go somewhere far away where nobody knows about any of this. Is that what you really want? Mrs. Chen asked. Annie was quiet for a long moment. No, she finally admitted. I love it here. I love the horses, I love the work, and She trailed off, unable to say the rest. You love Jack, Mrs. Chen finished for her. Annie nodded, fresh tears starting to fall. But loving him is ruining everything. His friends are turning against him. His business is suffering. And now his own employees are treating me like I'm some kind like you're something you're not. Mrs. Chen said firmly. Annie, listen to me. Sometimes when people are scared of change, they lash out at whatever they think is causing it. You and Jack caring about each other scares them because it challenges the way they think things should be. But what if they're right? Annie asked. What if I'm ruining his life? Before Mrs. Chen could answer, they heard Jack's voice calling out as he entered the house. Mrs. Chen, have you seen Annie? Roy said she seemed upset about something. Mrs. Chen and Annie exchanged glances. Roy had actually had the nerve to mention the incident to Jack, probably hoping to cause more trouble. She's here, Mrs. Chen called back. And yes, she's upset. You need to hear what happened. When Jack walked into the kitchen and saw Annie's tear-stained face, his expression immediately darkened. What's wrong? What happened? Annie looked at Mrs. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Annie told Jack everything that had happened in the barn. With each word, Jack's face grew angrier, until he looked like a man who was ready to commit violence. Those men are fired, Jack said the moment Annie finished her story. I'll have them off my property within the hour. Jack, no, Annie said quickly. If you fire them because of me, it will just prove what everyone is saying about us. I don't care what anyone is saying, Jack replied. No one treats you that way on my ranch. No one. But Annie could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to protect her, but doing so would cost him even more in the eyes of the community. The pressure was building from all sides, and something was going to have to give soon. That night, as Annie lay in her bed unable to sleep, she made a decision that she hoped would save Jack from losing everything he had worked so hard to build. Even if it meant breaking her own heart in the process. Annie woke up before dawn with her decision made. She had spent the entire night thinking about everything that had happened, and she knew what she had to do. Jack was losing everything because of her, and she couldn't let that continue. She dressed quietly and packed her few belongings into the same worn carpet bag she had arrived with months ago. Everything she owned fit easily into that small bag, just like it had the night Jack found her shivering at the train station. Before leaving her room, Annie sat down and wrote a letter to Jack. Her hands shook as she tried to find the right words to explain why she was leaving without saying goodbye. Dear Jack, she wrote, by the time you read this, I will be on the morning train to Denver. Please don't try to follow me or find me. I'm leaving because I care about you too much to watch you lose everything you've worked for because of me. You are a good man who deserves respect and success, not the gossip and trouble that comes with caring about someone like me. Find a woman who can stand beside you in society, someone who can help you instead of hurting you. Thank you for giving me a home when I had nowhere else to go. I will never forget your kindness, and I will always treasure the time we had together. Please take care of Thunder for me and tell Mrs. Chen that she was like a mother to me. Love always, Annie. She left the letter on her pillow and crept quietly through the house. In the kitchen, she took one last look around the place that had been her home, then slipped out the back door into the cold morning air. The walk to town took an hour, and with each step, Annie felt like she was leaving a piece of her heart behind. But she was doing the right thing, she told herself. Jack would be better off without her. At the train station, Annie bought a ticket to Denver with the money she had saved from her wages. She sat on the same bench where Jack had found her, watching the sun come up over the mountains and trying not to cry. Back at the ranch, Jack woke up in a good mood for the first time in weeks. He had spent the previous evening thinking about what Roy and Frank had done to Annie, and he had made his own decision. He was going to fire both men and make it clear to everyone that Annie was under his protection. He didn't care what the town thought anymore. Jack had also decided it was time to stop pretending that Annie was just an employee. He was in love with her and he was tired of hiding it. Today he was going to tell her exactly how he felt and ask her to marry him. If the town didn't like it, that was their problem. He dressed quickly and headed to the kitchen for his morning coffee, planning to find Annie and have the most important conversation of his life. But Mrs. Chen was waiting for him with a worried expression on her face. "Jack," she said quietly, "Annie's gone." "Gone where?" Jack asked, not understanding. Mrs. Chen handed him the letter that Annie had left on the kitchen table along with her room key. Jack read it twice, his heart sinking further with each word. "How long has she been gone?" he asked. "I don't know. Her bed wasn't slept in, so she must have left during the night." Jack looked at the clock on the wall. It was 7 in the morning and the train to Denver left at 8. If he hurried, he might be able to catch her before she left forever. "Saddle Thunder," he told Mrs. Chen, "and pray that I'm not too late." Jack rode harder than he had ever ridden in his life, pushing Thunder to his limits as they raced toward town. The black stallion seemed to understand the urgency, stretching his legs and flying over the snowy ground like his life depended on it. They reached the outskirts of town just as Jack heard the train whistle in the distance. The morning train was approaching the station, and in a few minutes, it would carry Annie away from him forever. Jack rode Thunder right down the main street of Riverside, causing quite a stir among the early morning shopkeepers and townspeople. He could see them pointing and staring, but he didn't care. Nothing mattered except reaching Annie before that train left. At the train station, Annie heard the approaching hoofbeats and turned to see Jack riding toward her at full speed. Her heart leaped with joy and terror at the same time. She had been hoping he would come after her, but she had also been praying he would let her go. Jack pulled Thunder to a stop and jumped down from the saddle, not even bothering to tie the horse. He ran toward Annie, who stood up from the bench but didn't move toward him or away from him. "Annie, don't do this," Jack said, breathing hard from the ride. "Don't leave." "I have to," Annie replied, tears already starting to fall. "You know I have to." "No, I don't know that. What I know is that I love you, and I'm not letting you leave because of what a bunch of small-minded people think." The train was getting closer, its whistle growing louder. Around the station, a small crowd was gathering to watch the drama unfold. Annie could see familiar faces from town, including Judge Harrison and his daughter Rebecca, who must have come to see someone off on the train. "Jack, please," Annie begged. "You're just making this harder." "Good," Jack said, moving closer to her. "It should be hard. Leaving someone you love should be the hardest thing in the world." "You'll lose everything," Annie said. "Your business, your friends, your place in society. I can't let that happen." "Those things don't matter if I don't have you," Jack replied. "Annie, I was empty before you came into my life. I had money and land and success, but I was miserable and lonely. You changed all of that." The train was pulling into the station now, steam hissing and brakes squealing as it came to a stop. The conductor stepped down and began calling for passengers to board. "All aboard for Denver and points west," he shouted. Annie picked up her bag, but Jack grabbed her hand. "Annie Walsh," he said loudly so that everyone gathering around could hear him clearly. "I am asking you not to get on that train." "Jack, people are watching," Annie whispered, embarrassed by all the attention. "Let them watch," Jack said. Then, to Annie's complete shock, he got down on one knee right there on the train platform in front of the whole town. The crowd gasped, and Annie heard Rebecca Harrison make a small sound of distress. Judge Harrison's face turned red with anger, but Jack didn't even look at them. "Annie Walsh," Jack said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I love you. I don't care that you don't have money or a fancy family name. I don't care what anyone in this town thinks about us. You are kind and smart and brave, and you make me want to be a better man." Annie was crying openly now, her bag forgotten at her feet. "Jack, get up, please," but Jack wasn't finished. "I know I don't have a ring with me, but I'm asking you anyway. Will you marry me? Will you stay here and build a life with me, no matter what anyone else says?" The train conductor was getting impatient. "Last call for Denver," he shouted. Annie looked at Jack, kneeling in the snow in front of her, his eyes full of love and hope. Then she looked at the crowd of townspeople, Some shocked, some disapproving, some actually smiling at the romantic scene. She thought about the letter she had written, about all her noble reasons for leaving. She thought about protecting Jack's reputation and saving him from social ruin. But then she thought about Mrs. Chen's words. The heart wants what it wants. Yes, Annie said quietly. What? Jack asked, not sure he had heard her correctly over the noise of the train. Yes, Annie said louder, laughing through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you. Jack jumped up and swept Annie into his arms, spinning her around while the crowd watched in amazement. Some people were clapping, some were frowning, and some were just standing there with their mouths open. Judge Harrison pushed through the crowd, his face furious. Jack Morrison, have you lost your mind? You can't marry this girl. Jack set Annie down but kept his arm around her. Judge, with all due respect, yes, I can. And I'm going to. This is a mistake that will ruin you, the judge said. No, Jack replied, looking down at Annie with love in his eyes. The only mistake would be letting her get on that train. As the train pulled away from the station without Annie on it, the crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with excitement about what they had just witnessed. Some were scandalized, some were romantic enough to be touched by the proposal, and all of them knew they had just seen something that would be talked about for years to come. Jack Morrison, the wealthiest man in the county, had just proposed marriage to a poor farm girl in front of the entire town. Their love story had just taken a turn that nobody could have predicted, and Riverside would never be the same again. The news of Jack's public proposal spread through Riverside like wildfire. By noon, everyone in town had heard about the dramatic scene at the train station. Some folks were outraged, others were charmed, and everyone had an opinion about whether the wealthy rancher had made the biggest mistake of his life. Judge Harrison was so angry that he spent the entire day pacing in his office, muttering about social order and proper behavior. His daughter Rebecca locked herself in her room and refused to come out, humiliated that the man she had expected to marry had chosen a farm girl over her. But not everyone in town was upset by the engagement. At the general store, Mary Peterson, the owner's wife, was actually excited by the romantic turn of events. Good for him, she told her customers, that Annie is a sweet girl who works hard and minds her own business. If Jack Morrison loves her, then she must be special. Old Doc Williams, who had delivered half the babies in town, nodded in agreement. I've seen that girl in action when she brought injured horses to me for treatment. She's got a good heart and a gentle touch. Jack could do a lot worse. At the ranch, Mrs. Chen was practically glowing with happiness as she prepared a celebration dinner. She had been hoping for this outcome for months, watching Jack and Annie dance around their feelings for each other. I knew this day would come, she told Pete when he stopped by the kitchen for coffee. Those two were meant for each other, anyone with eyes could see it. Pete grinned. About time, too. I was getting tired of watching them make sheep's eyes at each other when they thought nobody was looking. But the celebration at the ranch was tempered by the reality of what Jack and Annie would face. Over the next few days, the social consequences of Jack's decision became clear. Banker Fletcher made good on his threat, denying Jack's loan application and calling in some of his existing debts early. Several of Jack's regular cattle buyers suddenly found reasons to shop elsewhere. The winter social invitations that had already dried up were now replaced by cold shoulders and whispered conversations that stopped when Jack entered a room. Some of the newer ranch hands quit, unwilling to work for a man who had lost his mind over a woman. Roy and Frank, the two cowboys who had harassed Annie, spread nasty rumors around town about what had really been going on at the ranch. It's harder than I thought it would be, Jack admitted to Annie one evening as they sat by the fire in the main house. They were officially engaged now, with a simple gold ring that Jack had bought from the jeweler in town, ignoring the man's disapproving frown. We could still call it off, Annie said quietly, though the words hurt her to say. It's not too late for you to change your mind. Jack reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. Annie Morrison, he said, using her soon-to-be married name. I would rather be poor with you than rich without you. We're going to get through this together. And slowly, they did. The ranch operation continued, helped by the loyalty of the core group of cowboys who had worked for Jack for years. Pete, Billy, and Carlos made it clear that anyone who had a problem with Annie would answer to them. More importantly, Jack's business sense and Annie's practical knowledge proved to be a powerful combination. Annie's ideas about horse breeding turned out to be incredibly profitable. The foals from Thunder and some of the best mares were selling for twice what Jack had expected. "You were right about the breeding program," Jack told Annie as they watched a buyer pay top dollar for one of their young horses. "We're making more money from horses than we ever did from cattle." Annie smiled. Thunder knew what he was doing when he picked Daisy as his favorite. Their babies are going to be champions. As winter turned to spring, some of the social pressure began to ease. A few of the townspeople who had initially been scandalized by the engagement started to come around. They saw that Jack and Annie were genuinely happy together, and that their love was real and lasting. The turning point came when Dr. Williams needed help with a difficult horse surgery, and Annie assisted him with skill that impressed everyone who witnessed it. Word spread that Annie had not only helped save the animal, but had also refused payment for her time. "That girl's got more class in her little finger than some of these society ladies have in their whole bodies," Dr. Williams declared at the barbershop the next day. When the spring church social was organized, the committee found themselves split on whether to invite Jack and Annie. After much debate, they decided to extend an invitation, though they weren't sure the couple would accept. "Should we go?" Annie asked Jack when the invitation arrived. "Only if you want to," Jack replied. "I don't want you to feel like you have to prove anything to these people." Annie thought about it for a moment. "I think we should go. Not to prove anything, but to show them that we're not ashamed of our love." The night of the social, Annie wore her best dress, a simple blue gown that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew. She was nervous as they walked into the church hall, but Jack's steady presence beside her gave her strength. At first, the atmosphere was tense. Some people greeted them politely but coolly, while others simply ignored them. But as the evening progressed, things began to change. When the musicians started playing, Jack asked Annie to dance. They moved together beautifully, clearly comfortable with each other in a way that spoke of deep affection and respect. Watching them, some of the townspeople began to see past their prejudices to the genuine love between the couple. Mrs. Peterson was the first to approach them during a break between songs. "Annie, dear," she said warmly, "I wanted to tell you how lovely you look tonight. That color is perfect on you." Gradually, other people began to follow her lead. Not everyone warmed up to them, but enough did that the evening became enjoyable, rather than an ordeal. Judge Harrison and Rebecca stayed away from Jack and Annie all evening, but Doc Williams made a point of shaking Jack's hand and complimenting Annie on her help with his horse surgery. "You've got yourself a keeper there, Jack," the old doctor said with a wink. "Beautiful and useful, that's a rare combination." As summer approached, Jack and Annie began planning their wedding. They decided to keep it simple, with the ceremony at the small church on the edge of town and a reception at the ranch. "I don't need a fancy wedding," Annie told Mrs. Chen as they planned the menu. "I just want to marry Jack and start our life together officially." The wedding day dawned bright and clear, with wildflowers blooming in the meadows around the ranch. Annie wore a simple white dress that she and Mrs. Chen had made together, with a bouquet of wildflowers that Jack had picked for her that morning. The church was filled with an interesting mix of people. All the ranch hands were there, dressed in their best clothes and grinning broadly. Some of the townspeople who had come to accept the match attended, along with neighbors from surrounding ranches who cared more about Jack's character than his choice of bride. Judge Harrison and his supporters stayed away, but their absence didn't dampen the joyful atmosphere. As Annie walked down the aisle toward Jack, she saw nothing but friendly faces and people who wanted to celebrate their happiness. The minister, a kind older man who had known Jack since he was a boy, spoke about love conquering all obstacles and the importance of following your heart. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed Annie while the congregation cheered. The reception at the ranch was a lively affair, with Mrs. Chen's amazing food, music from a local fiddle player, and dancing that lasted until well after sunset. Even Thunder seemed to approve of the celebration, whinnying from his corral, as if adding his congratulations. As the last guest departed and Jack and Annie stood together on the porch of their home, looking out at the ranch they would build together, Annie marveled at how much her life had changed. "Are you happy?" Jack asked, putting his arm around his new wife. "Happier than I ever dreamed I could be," Annie replied. "Even with all the challenges we've faced, I wouldn't change anything. Not even the gossip and the social pressure?" Annie considered this. "You know what? No, not even that. Because it showed us what our love is really worth." If it had been easy, we might have taken it for granted. Going through those hard times together made us stronger. Over the following months and years, Jack and Annie's marriage proved all the doubters wrong. Their horse breeding operation became the most successful in the state. Annie's natural business sense and Jack's connections opened doors that neither could have managed alone. More importantly, their love story became legendary in Riverside. People began to tell it as an example of how true love could overcome any obstacle, and how sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. Years later, when visitors came to the ranch and saw the successful operation and the happy couple who ran it, they found it hard to believe that the whole town had once been against their marriage. Love has a way of winning in the end. Annie would tell their children when they asked about the early days. It just sometimes takes a while for everyone else to catch up, and in the barn, Thunder would still whinny his approval whenever Jack and Annie walked by together, as if he remembered being the matchmaker who brought them together on that snowy night when everything changed.